Hello, everyone. This is Whitney Will from Starhearth Astrology, and I am here to talk about the astrology of 2025. I'm going to do this in a couple ways. There's going to be one video that goes over the basic astrological forecast, and then I am going to do a video for each rising sign. So you can go find your rising sign, or you can listen to the whole thing and then go find your rising sign. That's going to break it down in terms of what you can expect in your life. As always, I am using whole sign houses. And so if you're used to a Placidus reading, this is going to be a little bit different than that. Okay, I have looked at the astrology for 2025, and all other things being equal, I think that it is Virgo risings that are going to have the biggest year in terms of the changes and events that they will see in major areas of their lives, right? This might not always be true. Obviously, if you have significant planets with a different rising sign that are getting hit, that's not to say that they will have the bigger year than anyone, but just looking at the basic astrology, Virgo risings, get ready for all of it to get. I am going to go through chronologically and try and give you a story and an overview of where you might be seeing those things. Now, on a personal level, this is also going to matter where all of your other planets are, what your profected house is for the year, and other ways of emphasizing transits. We start the year with Mercury newly stationed direct in your fourth house of home in Sagittarius. Moving forward, okay, we had the holidays with our family. Some offenses were taken, and now we're moving forward. Mars is retrograde in Leo at the very beginning of Leo, so about to retrograde back into Cancer, but still not to the midpoint, and the Mars has not come into an opposition with the Sun, which is like the biggest thing. We're still on the buildup to the biggest part of the Mars retrograde cycle. Mars stationed retrograde in the fall of 2024 in Leo, but has spent so much of its time and so much of the story is about Mars in Cancer. So that can really fracture your sense of who you are connected to, whose team you're on, whose political party you're a part of, right? There's a lot of contention in that area of your life, and that is going to continue into 2025, but tend towards resolution, at least in the later part of the year. We've got Mars doing that. Venus is at the very end of Aquarius as we start the year, about to start the major story, really, of the first 5 months of the year, which is the Venus retrograde in Aries and Pisces. That's where we're starting things off. We have Saturn towards the end of Pisces. We have Neptune towards the end of Pisces. We have Uranus towards the end of Taurus. We have Jupiter in the middle of Gemini. And I bring all those things up because there are a lot of endings and shifts with those outer planets that form so much of the heart of this year. Okay, so let's just jump in chronologically. Quarter one, so January, February, March, is for everyone going to be the biggest quarter of the year. And really, March is the biggest month in terms of the highest number of overlapping themes that are all piled on together that's going to affect everyone in personal ways, but especially Virgo risings because of where it lands in the chart. So ramping up January 2nd Venus enters Pisces. And this is one of the cool things about this year is that Venus will spend 2 full months in Pisces. So in the sign of her exaltation, in your house of relationships, which has been going through a lot of work, a lot of reflection, because we had Saturn enter Pisces in your house of relationships, trying to bring structure and understanding. And okay, I'm going to deal with my stuff in this house 2 years ago in March of 2023. So it's been this long process of reevaluating. How am I doing in relationships? How hard should I be working? And relationships have been a confusing place for some of you for almost all of your adult lives, because Neptune entered Pisces in 2011. Neptune and Pisces are blurring boundaries. They're doubling down on the tendency of Virgo risings to self-sacrifice, to try and save their partners, to fall in love with tortured people dealing with addiction, people dealing with overwhelming grief. There can be a real savior complex in that, either to receive that from others or to give that from others. And so Saturn has been trying to be like, okay, what are we doing here? Yes, let's fall in love with spiritual people, but we need spiritual people that can keep a job if we want to have the things that require that, if we want that kind of stability. So really pushing us to make those intentions. And this is a really big year for discernment and being able to figure that out, because so much of this Venus retrograde that is involved in the relationships for Virgo rising is also involved with Saturn. And when Venus and Saturn come together, especially right in a place where Venus is so powerful, what we are seeing is the possibility for deep and heartfelt commitment in this space, which comes from really our ability to commit over the long term, Saturn, with Venus, with connecting with what we truly value. And so the beginning part of this year is a really discernment around that. So that's what I'm thinking about as we start the year with Venus moving into Pisces and starting to think about, what do I want in a relationship, or simply just how I relate to people. If you do client work of any kind, this also involves your clients, business partnerships, all of those sorts of things. Also on that day, we get the second opposition of Mars with Pluto. Part of the story of this Mars retrograde that happens in the borderlands between Leo and Cancer is this opposition with Pluto at the very beginning of Aquarius. It's that second opposition. And this is really where we question our own strength, our own will, the power of our own heart in the sign of Leo to give us energy and power to move towards those things. 4 days later, Mars retrogrades into Cancer. So really, Mars in Cancer is the whole first quarter. Mars won't leave Cancer until mid-April. So we're really spending the first over 4 months with Mars in Cancer. Really, with Cancer, your tribe, your sense of who is on your team, who is supporting you, who you are trying to offer support to, and how that's going, which is, it's going through this reevaluation process. So we've got Mars into Cancer. About 10 days later, on January 15th, we have the Sun-Mars opposition, which is the heart of the Mars retrograde. When the Sun and Mars are 180 degrees, this happens at 26 degrees of Cancer. And this is really the battle of Mars. In the hero's journey, this is Mars, the hero facing down the dragon. And for most of us, that's the dragon in ourself, that's the dragon in our family, that's the thing that we try to avoid. And this is really about taking a look at that. So this can be a really intense moment. At the same time, just a couple days later, but approaching, on January 18th, we have Venus conjoining Saturn at 16 degrees of Pisces. And this is the first of 3 conjunctions that she will make with Saturn. And effectively, this kind of ties it in with the Mars retrograde cycle. They're in a very wide trine, but that trine will get tighter throughout that cycle. And this is Venus coming to Saturn and them having a conversation about what they really value, what's really realistic, Saturn, what we have the energy, what we really want to commit to, what we want to let go of. And Pisces is a beautiful sign that is able to let things pass, just dissolve back into the soup. So those are some of the things coming up there. On the 28th of January, the nodes, the mean nodes, will switch from Aries and Libra into Virgo and Pisces. So we've already had one Pisces eclipse that happened on September 17th of 2024, but it's not until the end of January that the nodes actually switch signs. And so we might start feeling the pressure of what it feels like to have the South Node in your first house and shedding these stories that you have told about who you are or who you have to be that no longer serve you. And the North Node in your 7th house is looking for, I want to be reflected in these ways, not in theory, not in fantasy, but actually. The North Node wants things to be embodied, wants things to be in the world, whereas the South Node can spiritualize them, right? We can have those things just in our feelings of faith. The North Node wants to see them, feel them, taste them insatiably. We're switching into that. And part of the first quarter is the eclipse cycle happening in those spaces. So we'll see very shortly. Finally, on January 30th, Uranus is going to station direct at 23 degrees of Taurus. This is in your 9th house of long-term planning, of long-distance travel. You have been really, since 2018, questioning your guiding principles for life. You have been questioning your values. And we're done with Uranus retrograde. Uranus is going to start moving forward again in the sign of Taurus, ultimately to enter Gemini for the first time in the summer. On February 1st, Venus conjoins Neptune at 28 degrees of Pisces. This is also the first of 3 conjunctions. And Venus serves this purpose in 2025 to guide both Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus across the threshold from where they start the year to these new sign ingresses. And so Venus is serving an almost mercurial psychopomp role of, okay, we are going to gather what the fruits of these transits were about and handhold them as they cross the threshold and integrate how have our values changed, how has what matters to us changed over the course of these transits that in Neptune's case began in 2011, in Uranus's case 2018, and Saturn 2023. On February 3rd, Venus enters Aries, so she's already in the shadow of her retrograde at this point. She is moving into Aries. This Venus retrograde harkens back to the Venus retrograde that occurred in the early spring, late winter of 2017. I'll be getting more focused in on this transit in forecasts that I do early in the year. But if you think back to that space and the kind of connections that were forming or dissolving around that space, we are going to be revisiting those people, those themes, and those levels of communication. On February 4th, Jupiter stations direct at 11 degrees of Gemini. So we're halting at 11 degrees of Gemini. We're going to move forward. Jupiter is in your 10th house and has been since May of 2024. So Jupiter is expanding your sense of self, your sense of legacy, right? Jupiter is shining a light right on what is on stage in your life. And that's one of the reasons why this is the biggest year for Virgo risings, because we've got Jupiter angular. Okay, what are you doing? How are you making progress on all of these things? You've got all of these options of how to expand your notion of who you are in the world and what you're known for. And the Jupiter-Saturn squares that have been occurring, the third and final one, which will happen this summer, have been, how do you balance your connection with other people with all of the options of who you could become in the world? So this can be a point at the beginning of February of really, as Jupiter stations direct, having a moment to really drop into yourself and figure out what you want to put your energy into and how your relationships and your location are supporting you doing that. On Valentine's Day, on February 14th, Mercury enters Pisces. And so this is significant because Mercury is going to be twinning with Venus and doing an Aries Pisces retrograde. And for Virgo risings, that is both the ruler of your 10th and your first house that is going to be retrograding between your 8th and your 7th house. Relationships really are the topic for the first quarter for Virgo risings. On February 22nd, Neptune conjoins the North Node, and there's going to be a Pisces stellium as part of the story of this, and that's going to be Venus and Saturn and Mercury and Neptune and the Sun at different points and the Moon. And the North Node is all there blowing things up. Things are going to be out of proportion. And the North Node wants more and is hungry, and there's a lot there for it to feast on. Neptune on the North Node is looking towards what is the biggest fantasy, which can be this great spiritual goal or can be a little bit delulu. So that is a kind of space where it gets inflated there at the end of February. Mars, the next day on February 23rd, stations direct at 17 degrees of Cancer. So we are at the end of the Mars retrograde. We are at the end of this sense of having to fight for something or having to reconcile ourselves with whatever Mars retrograde brought. For you, it's been for the last 2 months in Cancer, right? And maybe having to face some hard truths about boundaries it needs to set with people, about who is actually there for you and who maybe needs to be let out of your inner circle. And I think that can be connected with Neptune on the North Node in your 7th house of relationships, right? What do you want that space to look like and feel like? And how does Mars help you make those decisions? And do you need to change anything moving forward? On March 1st, Venus will station retrograde at 10 degrees of Aries. So in your 8th house of these intimate spaces, of this place where you differentiate yourself from other people, of this kind of balancing act to your 7th house, which can get a little bit enmeshed, which can really dissolve into the other. Your 8th house is a place where you actually do feel the difference. And so Venus stationing retrograde at 10 degrees of Aries in your 8th house is saying, hey, wait a moment. There's something else that needs to be negotiated in the relationship. Need to be a little bit more selfish about what's realistic for me. And she stations retrograde at 10 degrees. I want you to pay attention. It's almost 11 degrees, but we're in this window, and there is something quite poignant about this 10, 11 degrees of Aries, because we will have an eclipse very close to there, and Mercury will also station retrograde there. So there's something there that gets revisited both by a solar eclipse, this Venus retrograde, and this Mercury retrograde. So pay special attention because it's all connected, which makes it a little bit convoluted, but also, right, systemic in terms of your life. On the 2nd, Mercury will conjoin Neptune at nearly 29 degrees of Pisces. So again, this is Mercury connecting with the dreams, but Mercury's in the shadow of its retrograde. So we're gathering those themes as well. On the 3rd, Mercury enters Aries. And then a week later, on the 11th, Mercury is going to conjoin a retrograde Venus at 8 degrees of Aries. And so this is going to be important because Mercury and Venus are comparing notes. Venus is already retrograde at this point, and they're connecting over, okay, how Venus is getting a sense, but remember, Venus is going to feel through the heart and the sense of attraction. For those things to be translated into thoughts, we need Mercury. So Mercury connecting with Venus, those insights might flash into our minds. We've been having this feeling about things, and Mercury is going to be like, okay, I'm going to download the information. 2 days later, there is a lunar eclipse in Virgo, so in your 1st house, which means that these insights about how you are in relationship affects your sense of self, because we have a lunar eclipse on the south node in the house of your self-concept. And this is the realization of, I'm not who I thought I was. I actually want to be something else. I have been thinking that I'm this type of person, and this doesn't really serve me anymore. And really feeling the absence of this thing, of noticing, okay, there's something missing in this space, whether it is an unfulfilled dream or wish or an unacknowledged truth about who we are. And so really what I'm going to talk about in these, from this lunar eclipse until the end of March, is the most complicated, busiest astrology of the year for everyone, not just for you, but the way where it will show up for Virgo risings is in your relationship houses and what you offer others of yourself. Here we go. We have our lunar eclipse. The next day, Mercury stations retrograde at 9.5 degrees of Aries. There we are again, this point in Aries. Mercury is, okay, I'm going to go back and check that, right? Mercury is the ruler of that lunar eclipse that happened the day before. The ruler of that lunar eclipse is stationing retrograde. Your chart, your 10th house ruler is stationing retrograde in the 8th house. All eyes on what you keep to the shadows. The shadow part of yourself that comes up in relationships because you can't avoid it. You're looking to the things that you try to keep hidden, largely because of shame. Now, it's interesting when we're talking about Virgo risings because we've got Aries in the 8th house. Your spontaneity, your joy, your impulsiveness, your selfishness. Mercury is, hold the phone. There is something that we need to re-examine in this space from March 14th. forward. So now we have both Venus and Mercury retrograde during eclipse season in the second half of March. On the 19th, the Sun will conjoin Neptune at 29 degrees of Pisces. This is the Sun together with Neptune, probably their last conjunction in Pisces, this last space, this kind of swan song at the anaretic degree of Pisces. The Sun really connecting with, okay, what are the final kind of sense of power and purpose of what Neptune has done in our relationships and spiritualizing our relationships for Virgo risings. 3 days later, there is the Sun-Venus cazimi at 2.5 degrees of Aries. So that is the heart of the Venus retrograde. That's where we get this kind of gem of wisdom, where we figure out what it was about, where we've reconciled the thing, where we understand what we're doing. And 2 days after that, we have the Sun-Mercury cazimi. That also happens in Aries. Sun-Mercury cazimi happens at 4.5 degrees of Aries. So we're having these connections. And remember, the Sun is exalted in Aries. It's really able to take to heart and be emboldened in Aries, connecting with Venus and Mercury and what they have found so far on their retrograde journeys. On March 27th, Venus is going to both retrograde back into Pisces and conjoin Neptune at the very end of Pisces. So this is the second of 3 conjunctions with Neptune that Venus will make, right? So she is visiting Neptune again. She is going back into Pisces. She is going to be in Pisces now for another month. So this is our second month of 2025 with Venus in the sign of her exaltation. So this real sweetness. And she's moving back to Saturn to say, oh, maybe I blew you off the first time. Like, now I'm ready to commit to the work of this and of really receiving the lessons of this Saturn transit through my 7th house. 2 days later, on the of March, we get our second eclipse in the spring's eclipse season, and that is a solar eclipse at 9 degrees of Aries. We've got the Sun that had its cazimi with Venus, that had its cazimi with Mercury, and it is eclipsed at 9 degrees of Aries, right? Really having that, whatever it's about, hit home about how to be in that Aries space, about how to be in your 8th house. And you will be able to communicate that in Piscean ways. So, because on the same day, Mercury retrogrades back into Pisces and conjoins Neptune in the very last arc minute of Pisces. So, Mercury, the ruler of your chart, the ruler of your 10th house, moves back into your 7th house and conjoins Pisces on the same day of the solar eclipse. This is the last eclipse in Aries. This is the ending of this cycle and this shakeup of your personal finances and your debts and the stories therein, and the actual monetary ones and the psychological ones. And finally, on March 30th, Neptune will ingress into Aries, the first of the major planetary ingresses that are the heart of the story of 2025. In the heart of the Mercury retrograde and eclipses and the Venus retrograde, Neptune crosses the border from Pisces into Aries. And Neptune moves out of your 7th house for the first time in 14 years and into the much more shadowy space of the 8th, bringing its numinousness therein. From there, we move into Q2 of the year. And it's a funny boundary line because all of the stories of March, they start resolving in April, but Q2 is more like part 2 of Q1. It's like the resolution, because when we move into April's really trying to, as I say, resolve those things, finish up those retrogrades. Venus conjoins the North Node on April 2nd for the second of 3 times at 26 degrees of Pisces. And then Venus conjoins Saturn on April 7th at 25 degrees. Now, it's a little bit of a misnomer to say that Venus conjoins Saturn 3 times, because really, Venus is slowing down by this point. So she really doesn't come out of aspect with that conjunction with Saturn for quite a long time. Really, at least through the end of April. So she is exalted conjoining Saturn for all of April. So this is the time of sorting through the reasons of the heart and figuring out what actually matters to you. And it doesn't matter what it is, as long as you have the strength to let your body love what it loves and commit to it. Also on April 7th, so on that same day, Mercury stations direct at 26 degrees of Pisces. So Mercury's stationing direct within 1.5 degrees of Saturn as well. Okay, here we go. Here's our plan. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop moving backwards. I have checked in about this stuff. Now I have a sense of where our values are. So even though Venus isn't direct, we're gonna start integrating this into our self-concept and into our life's work, which is what Mercury influences for Virgo risings. On April 12th, Venus stations direct at 24.5 degrees of Pisces. So right within 5 days, we are direct, but we're sitting there stationary, connected with Saturn. So it's going to be a slow kind of uptake for the two of them, because they have had this really sobering moment of the ends of their retrograde being conjunct Saturn. On April 17th, Mars enters Leo. From January 6th to April 17th, we have had Mars in your 11th house of friendships and groups. It's going to move back into your 12th house. And honestly, in my experience, sometimes when transiting planets move into the 12th house, there's this sense of like, where'd they go? They used to have that faculty, that capacity, and now I can't find it, or I find it only in weird ways. I almost feel like this Mars going into Leo is exhaustion for you based on the intensity of the transits of the beginning of this year, and especially of the 6 weeks before Mars enters Leo. This is almost, okay, please take a rest, take a break, take a nap. With Mars in Leo, it's still not clear of the shadow of its retrograde, and it's not onto new territory, right? Mars entered Cancer in the beginning of September of 2024. We've been dealing with the same themes for a long time, but it's almost like it wants to go dissociate somewhere for a little bit. Yeah, take a break. On April 20th, Venus conjoins the North Node for the 3rd time, but again, it's stationed pretty much right on the North Node. So I'm not sure that there will be much of a feeling of distinction between that. And then on the 24th, Venus conjoins Saturn again, exactly. But like I said, they've been right on top of each other. On the 26th, Mars forms its 3rd and final opposition with Pluto. That transit that began the year with that Mars-Pluto opposition that was the second of three, we get the third of three. So this final kind of gong in the movements of Mars's dance with Pluto. On April 30th, Venus moves back into Aries. So she wraps up her time in Pisces, moves back into Aries, still is not clear of the shadow of her retrograde, but she's no longer in this dance with Saturn. On May 2nd, Venus conjoins Neptune at 1 degree of Aries. And those two previous conjunctions happened in Pisces, but the third one for Venus and Neptune happens in Aries. So Neptune and Venus have this perspective shift together about what they owe the other and the possibility that following the inspirations and spontaneity of selfhood is as much a gift as any level of self-sacrifice. On May 4th, Pluto stations retrograde at 3 degrees and 49 arc minutes of Aquarius. So that is our yearly kind of span. That's how deep Pluto's getting into Aquarius. And on May 17th, the Sun conjoins Uranus for what is likely its last Sun-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. So that happens at 27 degrees. So these kind of one of the final big hits of the information and the shifts that Uranus has given us in the sign of Taurus. Finally, on May 24th, Saturn enters Aries. So we get our first ingress of Saturn into Aries. And Saturn entering Aries will have a certain harshness. And I'll get more into this in the general transit. But Saturn entering your 8th house, I have seen this with people, right? In some ways, it is the resolution of Saturn transiting the 7th. So that can look like making a big commitment to relationships that started with Saturn in Pisces, marriage, right? We got together with Saturn in the 7th house, and now we're going to make this commitment and legally bind all of our stuff to each other with Saturn and Aries. That can also look like breaking up. Like we've been struggling to figure out if this was going to work with Saturn in the 7th. And you know what? I'm just not ready to make this kind of commitment to you. You must reach the point where it's okay, now is the point where you would make the commitment. And Saturn comes down and the results of the Venus retrograde and the value shifts of the Venus retrograde. And Saturn just says, I can't do it. I'm going to use the sickle of Saturn and I'm going to end this. So that can happen there. On June 9th, we have Jupiter entering into Cancer. And this is one of my favorite transits of 2025 for everyone, but I also really love this for Virgo risings because you've just had this long transit of Mars in the 11th house, of working with people that you can't stand or are hurting you in some way, of having to do this really painful work to sort through that space. And then when Jupiter moves into Cancer, Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. Jupiter opens up this new world of who you connect with and who you belong to. And I think that Jupiter in Cancer, especially for Virgo risings in their 11th house, offers a possibility of the felt sense of belonging that is key to all kinds of existential well-being. So I think that this is a really beautiful transit. And I also love it as the ruler of your 7th house and your 4th house. Jupiter rules your 4th and 7th and is moving into the space of its exaltation, which means you're looking for closeness and belonging in your relationships and your home, your foundation. And Jupiter is really empowered. in that space for you. Just wonderful. Jealous. I wish I were a Virgo rising just for that. Okay, then on June 15th, Mars will square Uranus at 28 degrees of Leo and Taurus. And I added in these aspects with Mars and Uranus for this year because by the time we get to the end of this year, the final Mercury retrograde of the year is so much about the relationship between Mars and Uranus. So this is just a point that I'm dropping in my mind, right? Mars square Uranus tends to be explosive and it tends to break stuff. So I'm looking at that for that, but I'm also tracking this larger theme of the relationship between Mars and Uranus that comes to a head by the end of the year when we have oppositions. Jupiter squares Saturn on the same day at 1 degree of Cancer and Aries. And this is also tracking this larger theme because one of the main stories of the astrology of 2024 was these Jupiter-Saturn squares and this desire to like stretch and see how much we could expand, but then also restrict between Gemini and Pisces, and where we were like breaking out into new spaces and then doubt was pulling us back in. And their final square in this story is in Cancer and Aries, is in Jupiter in exaltation and Saturn in its fall. I'm not sure what we do there. Saturn is in its fall, but it's also in the overcoming position of that. So we've got two very fierce planets newly ingressed into this new sign. Jupiter is creating connection. Saturn is in this very martial sign where it can do a lot of damage. And so those two are in a tug of war right here about what we keep safe and what we're willing to destroy or fight for, destroy while we're fighting for. On June 17th, Mars enters Virgo. And this just feels so significant because for the first time since September of 2024, Mars is in a new sign. So we have spent, right, nearly a year of Mars working and grinding and pushing in the same areas of frustration, of this irritable space of Mars and Cancer. And finally, Mars enters Virgo and Mars enters your first house and you have this sense of will again. Hopefully you took a little bit of a nap and then Jupiter entered your 11th house of friends. You realize that you do have hope and belonging and connection and you're being fed. And Mars enters Virgo and you are ready to do what Virgos do best, which is take on things and focus on them and figure them out and be present and be detail oriented and care about the ideals at the heart of issues. What happens after the summer solstice is my favorite lunation of 2025, and that's why I put it in. On June 25th, there is a new moon that happens at 4 degrees of Cancer conjunct Jupiter at 3 degrees of Cancer. Not only is the moon in the sign of her rulership, the Cancer new moon I think of as like the moon's birthday every year, but it's also conjunct our exalted Jupiter in Cancer. It's just so sweet. Plan something special, something emotional, something connective, a new beginning, right? A gathering of your friends and your people. And that brings us to the end of quarter 3. Because what happened on the last day of quarter 1 was that Neptune moved into Aries. And what happens in the first week of quarter 3 is that Uranus moves into Gemini. Those kind of sandwich quarter 2, and we also had Saturn ingress into a new sign and Jupiter ingress into a new sign. So really, I think the kind of theme for quarter two is all of these planetary ingresses into these new areas, even though they're within a week of switching. On the 4th of July, Venus conjoins Uranus at the very last degree of Taurus, right? This is the ruler of Taurus conjoining Uranus there for the last time. And again, fulfilling this Venusian role of this thing that she does this year of kind of meeting with these planets in their last moments before they move on to new territory. Also on the 4th of July, Neptune stations retrograde at 2 degrees of Aries. So a big theme in quarter three is going to be the retrograde stations of all of these outer planets that are then moving backwards, that have pushed forward over a lot of quarter two, and as a process over quarter three, will start moving backwards. On July 7th, we have Uranus ingress into Gemini. Again, this is Uranus moving into your 10th house after Jupiter spent a year there looking at possibilities. This is the moment when you quit the job to become a freelancer, when you get more interested in weird hobbies, right? Where your sense of who you have to be in the world, how you have to show up in this 10th house way is like your freak flag gets to fly, and you're going to have a lot of time over the next few years to explore that. Because if you're attached to a title, to a job title, to a career, unless it is really serving your growth and individuality, Uranus has a tendency to either help you walk away from it or sabotage things until you walk away from them. And so that's what we are moving into. You are about to get very interesting. On July 12th, Saturn stations retrograde at almost 2 degrees of Aries. So we've got Saturn halting. And 5 days later, on the 17th, Mercury stations retrograde at 15 degrees of Leo. So here is where you get to have your chart ruler retrograde in your 12th house, going back into this deep space. Again, I think this can also be a kind of burnout. And maybe if that Uranus ingress brings, I quit my job. Mercury retrograde in Leo is what did I just do? What am I going to do? What do I even want? Who am I anymore? So those are the kinds of questions of the Mercury retrograde in Leo for you. On July 31st, we have the Sun Mercury cazimi at 9 degrees of Leo. At 9 degrees of Leo, remember, it is trine that 9 degrees of Aries space that had all this activity, right? There's a little bit of a hearkening back to that space. A big piece of this can be coming back to the exiled parts of yourself. And a big piece of this retrograde can be about finding those pieces that really need to be a part of you while we're moving forward. August, we have Mars opposite Saturn at 1 degree of Libra and Aries. So Mars has moved into Libra in the beginning of August and opposes Saturn, which feels significant because Mars rules Saturn. Saturn is in the place of its fall. This is a real tension between how do we compromise? And this is the first time that Mars has come into a hard aspect with the big players currently in its diurnal sign of Aries. The next day, Mars will oppose Neptune, and Neptune and Saturn are so close, but they still haven't completed exactly their conjunction. I feel like it's like a season of a show that keeps getting delayed. You keep thinking that they're going to tell you this final part of the story, and you keep having to wait. So we're getting closer and closer, but they still haven't come into their complete conjunction. On August 11th, Mercury stations direct at 4 degrees of Leo. So thank goodness Mercury is going to be direct in time for your season. And also on August 11th, Venus conjoins Jupiter, which seems like just also such a lovely transit for you this year of Venus conjoining Jupiter at 14 degrees of Cancer, right in the heart of the space of friendship. So if you are wondering when to schedule family time or schedule like friend vacation time, I would definitely do it at this part of August, because having both Venus and Jupiter in your 11th house is just so sweet. On August 24th, the sun will square Uranus at 1.5 degrees of Virgo and Gemini. And I put this in here because this is the sun. We're getting one of our luminaries to make a hard aspect with Uranus, newly ingressed into Gemini. So this might be a time when we really connect with what are some of the themes and the effects that we will see with Uranus in Gemini. So if you didn't quit your job in July, maybe you will do it at the end of August. On September 1st, Saturn retrogrades back into Pisces. On the 5th, Uranus stations retrograde at 1.5 degrees of Gemini. And on the 7th, there's a lunar eclipse at 15 degrees of Pisces. So here we are moving back into this Pisces Virgo axis as we enter the first and actually only eclipse season that will be entirely in Virgo and Pisces. So we are going to check in September on the themes that got opened in the March eclipse season. We are checking back in on your self-concept, on your relationships, and seeing how much has been done, what have we learned, how have we integrated the gifts and the fruits of that Venus retrograde and that Mercury retrograde. On the 20th, we have the sun opposite Saturn at 28 degrees of Virgo and Pisces. And the 21st, we have a solar eclipse at 29 Virgo. And this eclipse is such a puzzle to me because, for one thing, it is the only solar eclipse in the whole Virgo Pisces eclipse cycle, which began in September of 2024 and we won't have our last one until February of 2027. So it's a long story, but in those 7 eclipses, 6 of them are lunar eclipses, and it's only this one that's a solar eclipse. And it is a solar eclipse at the very final degree at 29 degrees of Virgo opposite Saturn. So in terms of a solar eclipse being a new beginning, it is like the least beginning. It's on the south node. It is opposite Saturn. Let's hold the phone. Stop. And it's in the 11th hour of the anaretic degree. So this one feels like this one is, I think, more about surveying what we would have done differently if we could, and reconciling ourselves with that. Because if we try to push forward, we may be able to do it a little bit, but opposite Saturn, it's far more likely that we will struggle for a long time before we finally say, we're just not moving forward, doing things in this way. And this comes from somebody who began my labor with my first child on a Cancer new moon opposite Saturn, and 4 days of no sleep and no food later said, fuck this, give me a C-section. I have personal lived experience of this. It wasn't an eclipse, but it was just impossible to progress in that space. And that brings us into quarter 4. Quarter 4 is in many ways the quietest quarter of 2025, but it will see a lot of the planets, right? Saturn has already ingressed back into Pisces. We'll see the other planets return to the positions that they began the year in, and a complicated Mercury retrograde that involves Mars and Uranus. Pluto will station direct at 1 degree of Aquarius on October 13th. On October 22nd, Neptune is going to retrograde back into Pisces. And on November 7th, Uranus retrogrades back into Taurus. So now we have Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus back into the signs to do their kind of last visit to those spaces, to get the last pieces of something that maybe wasn't totally addressed in their time there. On November 9th, so right after Uranus retrogrades back into Taurus, Mercury is going to station retrograde at 7 degrees of Sagittarius. 2 days later, Jupiter stations retrograde at 25 degrees of Cancer. So again, we've got all this slowing down, stopping, integrating, hopefully resting. On November 20th, we have the Sun Mercury cazimi that happens at 28 degrees of Scorpio opposite Uranus. Mars is going to be involved in this story because Mars is in Scorpio at this point, making the opposition to Uranus. And that Mercury retrograde conjoins Mars 3 times, opposes Uranus 3 times. So the tension returns back to your 9th and 3rd house axis. For this one, in some ways quieter. The Sagittarius and Gemini part of this would be more intense in terms of changing where you live and what you're doing. But again, I think we are all just integrating everything that has happened this year. The Sun opposes Uranus on November 21st. And I point this out because the Sun had that final conjunction with Uranus also at 29 degrees of Taurus. And so this opposition is at 29 degrees of Taurus, right? We're back to the same spot, right? We are gathering those last pieces of those last big shifts that Uranus and Taurus brought us. We had to go back to get the postscript. On November 27th, Saturn stations direct at 25 degrees of Pisces, the same degree where Venus stationed direct all those months ago in April. Saturn is reminding us of the promises we made in that space and coming back to what our sense of value was and what our intentions were. How did we do? On November 29th, Mercury stations direct at 20 degrees of Scorpio. And on the same day, Venus opposes Uranus at 29 degrees of Scorpio and Taurus. Again, opposing Uranus at the same degree that she made her final conjunction, right? Again, questioning how was our intentions there. On December 10th, Neptune stations direct at 29 degrees of Pisces. And what's interesting to me about this is that we end up ending the year in kind of a similar space that we began it, with Mercury freshly direct. In Sagittarius, we have Saturn in Pisces and Neptune in Pisces and Uranus and Taurus. But we have absorbed the first shock waves of those planetary transitions. And Virgo risings have had 2 eclipses in their first house, 1 in their 7th, 1 in their 8th. They have had Mercury go retrograde in their shadow fire houses, and Jupiter bringing a sense of expansion into the 10th house of career and the 11th house of friendships and connections. Uranus has rocked the self-concept in terms of moving into the 10th house, letting our individuality shine, and Venus and Mercury have renegotiated what we are willing to offer and share in our relationships. If you want to connect with me for a personal reading of this year and break it down in ways that include all the parts of your chart, not just your rising sign, you can book on my website at starheartastrology.com. Subscribe to my channel and I'll break down all of these transits more in depth as we move throughout the year. You can also listen to these videos as podcasts through my podcast, Dually Noted, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you.